Story RH, the podcast that makes a long story short.
Welcome to all.
History is made of stories.
In this episode, we'll be talking about money and the ins and outs of compensation policies.
Money can't buy happiness, as they say. Nevertheless, compensation is an important motivational factor for employees, though it's definitely not the only one.
But how do companies really decide how much to pay people? What goes into a compensation policy? What's the story?
Let's start by properly defining our terms. It's important not to confuse compensation practices, the current state of affairs, with compensation policy, which is about the rules which we would like to apply.
In other words, compensation policy is a collection of principles that guide us as we determine compensation levels in the broadest terms of total compensation, which we tackle in another episode. These rules and principles are theoretically designed to align practices with policy goals over time.
Basically, when it comes to compensation, it's like everything else. It's best to do what you say and say what you do to reconcile policy and practice.
And here, compensation policy is about the principles that guide the way we determine a person's compensation. It's based on three crucial questions.
When talking about compensation, we all naturally think how much first. And that's perfectly legitimate because, in the end, that is what compensation is about. But it's actually not the first question to ask when it comes to compensation policy. Quite the contrary, actually.
You're right, the how much sends a message to employees who are all looking to be rewarded for what they do and to figure out how to improve their lot. In other words, compensation is a real driver that shapes and guides individual and collective efforts and behaviors.
That's why the first question to ask when it comes to compensation policy is what? What are we paying for? What are the fundamental principles we want to reward? Results, effort, years with the company, performance, and the list goes on.
If a company increases your base salary every year just because you've been with them a year longer, regardless of your performance, you're getting a very clear message: to improve your lot, all you have to do is stay and get older. This approach doesn't exactly encourage effort on your part.
So, the first question is about the values you reward via your compensation policy. The first things taken into account are often your responsibilities, the importance of your position assessed using a method, like the Hay method for example, which underpins a classification that determines which base salary bracket you should fall under.
And an assessment of how well you do your job, something like starting out, fulfills, masters, excels, to determine where you fit within the bracket.
And there's often a variable component to reward your performance based on achieving set targets. In short, a collection of principles that answer the questions, what are we paying for, and to what end?
The second question is about how you pay it. There are many possible components when it comes to total compensation, but they don't all fulfill the same goals. A variable bonus paid immediately in cash is less likely to foster employee loyalty than deferred compensation.
The different options also mean that, with all other things being equal, you can adjust to suit the needs of different populations.
But that doesn't mean we can avoid the famous how much question. It's the third question to ask. And there are principles and rules to determine the answer: internal equity and external competitiveness.
Internal equity is about respecting the principles we mentioned earlier when talking about the what. In other words, you have to ensure that compensation is fair with respect to the rules laid out.
And external competition is about making sure that your packages are competitive on the market, making them attractive. In other words, attract, retain, and motivate, as the saying goes.
To recap, compensation policy determines how we organize compensation within a company. It is based on three questions: what are you paying for? How are you paying it? And how much are you paying? With attention paid to internal equity and external competitiveness. Is that right?
Exactly right. Way to make a long story short.
Story RH, the podcast that makes a long story short.